Hi, and welcome back to the European VC, the go-to podcast for everything European VC. If you love the show, share it with your friends and join our newsletter at EU.VC. Today, we're happy to welcome Sergey, founding partner of LongeVC, a venture capital company supporting early-stage biotech and longevity-focused founders that are changing the world. Sergey is a serial entrepreneur, having co-founded 3 deep tech ventures and raised more than $40 million in venture funding for his own ventures, and as an entrepreneur in residence. If you enjoy our content, do support us by hitting the follow button, giving us a review, and following the European VC on LinkedIn.
Sergey, welcome to the European VC podcast. Super nice to have you here today. How's everything?
Thank you for having me. Everything is exciting, and I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you, man. So are we. It's actually interesting. So you are joining us, to talk about an interesting topic called longevity. And I have to start by asking, how the hell does one end up being a longevity specialized investor? That is an uncommon route, I would say.
I think it's a very individual road to go for everyone, I guess, in this field, because if you sample longevity investors across several funds and you ask them the very same question, they would give you very different answers of how they actually ended up in the space. But the reality of it is, in my case, I kind of, and this is, by the way, true for the other 2 partners in the fund, or 3 partners in the fund. We kind of ended up by constantly immersing ourselves more and more into medical devices, into pharma, and then we ended up essentially in longevity as a part of biotech, as a very dedicated part of pharma tech, which it is now. By the way, the most fastest growing part of biotech as we speak. So it was a very gradual move. I mean, for myself, for the sake of background. I am a founder by background, right? So I started my first company when I was 22 years old. And that was in engineering. That was not in biotech at all. So that was an engineering startup for one of the super conservative industries out there, right? Which was actually oil and gas. We then co-founded another company. So I was always fascinated by life sciences. I never had an education, mind you, in life sciences. So I never had a medical background or anything. So we then started another company in medical devices. So that was the first step into sort of the biotech business, if you wish. And that company in medical devices was specifically in drug-eluting implant coatings. So we were creating drug-eluting coatings for orthopedic and dental implants for sort of personalized treatment, right? And easing all the post-operative effects for patients, like inflammation, stimulating bone growth, et cetera, et cetera. We then decided, and I decided specifically that I'd like to spend even more time and dive even deeper into pharma. And in my case, that was, you cannot simply start working in pharma if you don't have the education and track record. So for me, I was capable of kind of started to work with early stage therapeutic startups. Specifically, in my case, that was fields of cardiovascular disease and the neurodegenerative diseases, so CVD and neurodegenerative. And I collaborated with them as an entrepreneur in residence. Pretty much, I helped them fundraise. I helped them define their clinical strategies. So once they go into the human phases, and I also helped them define their IP protection strategies. And IP has been sort of my specific field of interest, right? Because in biotech, intellectual property is sort of a make it or break it component. This is how I spent, another 3 years of my life. And then we have co-founded another company, which dealt specifically with speeding up clinical trials for pharma and optimizing patient identification and patient onboarding into clinical trials. And quite organically, we ended up in a situation where throughout all these dealings with all the previous endeavors of ours, we ended up knowing people that we're gradually becoming KOLs in longevity and gradually becoming KOLs in age-related diseases, right? So we organically kind of grew the network around us.
Sorry, KOLs meaning key opinion leaders, because that's a term
yes,
not everyone might be familiar with.
That is true. So we grew the network of essentially key people in longevity and age-related diseases fields. We also grew the network of relationships with key research institutions, which are very active in spinning off basically most promising science and making startups out of it, right? Which is very common in the US part of the world. So this is how we pretty organically, I would say, ended up as a team in longevity, right? And then every partner has a different twist, and a slightly different role that was completed. But yeah, here we are.
And if I remember correctly, the first time we chatted, we spoke a bit about the origin of the fund and what you guys were doing before. And you guys also had, at least yourself, and correct me if I'm wrong, some track record as angel. So I'd love to ask you a bit about that transition from angel to fund manager.
Right. So I think the most prominent background, angel background, is actually with Gary, one of our partners, and this is where Gary was when LongeVC existed only as a team of people. It didn't exist as a fund, right? So it was not yet formalized in a vehicle, in an entity. Gary was the one behind essentially pre-seed backing some of the very famous longevity companies as we know them now, right? Where one of which is of course in silico medicine, and in silico medicine grew to be a powerhouse for AI for drug discovery, right? And this is where it was a very early investment that was led by Gary and sort of put together by Gary in a company which is now a unicorn, right? So they're, I think, close to 2 billion in valuation, contracts with major pharma, et cetera, et cetera. There were also deals done in animal longevity. There were also deals done in the field of aging clocks specifically. But then again, I mean, if you're doing angel investing, you can kind of only do this much, right? So you have limited capital. You are pretty limited in terms of the due diligence resource that you can deploy. You're pretty limited in the stage where you can participate. So realistically, I think for a lot of business angels that are well versed in a specific field and spend time in a specific field, transitioning into the fund is a very organic move. Mm-hmm. And then again, a lot of people in longevity in general, and this is also the case with us as partners, we also have our own personal footprint with longevity or age-related diseases in general, right? So some have cases of age-related diseases in the family, which ended tragically or are continuing to evolve, right? But with no reasonable resolution, because these are diseases that you cannot actually treat as of now. Some, like myself, for example, so I can be considered a rare disease patient by pharma standards. I'm on the neurological, so neurodegenerative side. And this is where it's not me running around and, searching for treatment, but rather, me understanding that I was actually 27 years old when I had the opportunity to feel how it is to be an 80-year-old, right? Where you basically lose some of your basic functions to certain degenerative processes. In my case, these return back, right? But technically speaking, like, I felt that, and it sucks. It is very mentally and physically hard, to find yourself in the deterioration spiral. So, a lot of this ending up in the longevity movement has to do with the personal component to it as well. And yeah, it's a combo. It's always a combo, but very, very practically, from being an angel into starting a fund, it's just a bump up in your capacity to back these projects.
So Sergey, I'm always super curious to understand the background of the LP base of something that has such a strong visionary component, just as the impact side and the climate side of VC firms typically have LPs with a certain profile. Is it the same for you?
It's actually a very interesting question. So when it's not very typical. The short answer is, so when we started to put the fund together, we obviously, our first base of LPs that we reached out to were our private network, right? So people that we worked with, people that knew us as from previous businesses as professionals. And what we have quickly realized is that a lot of LPs that consider longevity to be the next big field where to deploy capital, they don't necessarily have the biotech background. but they do understand that this is the place to be. So this is going to be the industry, the part of biotech that will experience the highest growth in the next decade. So for a lot of LPs, joining a fund is also a very educational component, where we have LPs that made their money elsewhere. They made their money in software, for example, right, or even traditional businesses, essentially. But they're using the fund, and they're using the fact that they're joining the fund as the educational base for them to understand the industry better. More to that, so when we started to build and put together the LP base, we realized that the added value that we as general partners should provide to our LPs is this proactive educational component. And this is where we actually make sure that we inform them about the logic behind the decisions, about the logic behind the deals. When we have an allocation of biotech VCs, we always act in the area of allocations, right? So we try to get into deals that are not necessarily on the market. So when the fund has an allocation, we always try to carve out a piece to offer our LPs a co-investment opportunity, for example, where they would follow the fund, they would follow our due diligence. And this is how we kind of expose them gradually to this field. But realistically, getting back to your question, it is a mix. Some of the investors already have the biotech exposure, and they want longevity specifically. They want age-related diseases, and it's best to do it with a fund because we as a team understand it better, essentially. And some actually want to educate themselves, and that's also true for a lot of LPs.
So now I'm going to use a word that's not necessarily nice, and it isn't meant bad, but I'm right in saying that you don't have many that have a pure play money grab with the investment. It's not only about the returns for most of your LPs. It's actually because they care for the space and want to understand the space.
I think it's always
of course, you're always in it for the returns as well. Otherwise you'd go to evening school.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a non-profit, right? So everyone, the fund is being put together with the purpose of multiplying LP capital, right? So for the purpose of making successful investments. That being said, this fact doesn't exclude the other thing, which is when making investments, you can actually make impactful investments, and you can actually push the field forward, right? By creating these next-gen success stories in the longevity field. And when you're creating these next-gen success stories, more capital comes into the field, right? And you are kind of contributing to the whole sort of well-being of the industry. So the answer is it's both. Our LPs trust us to make financial decisions, but it's also, of course, a certain visionary component to it. But then again, I mean, biotech has good multipliers. Right. So
I didn't say that
for
disregard returns at all. It was more to kind of frame the.
It's a combo. Yes, it's a combo.
Okay, but David, would you be okay with me asking Sergey to dive super deep into where he sees longevity as a space going, and why? Because you've said it a couple of times, Sergey. We are, it's going to be for the next 10 years in longevity that biotech is going to grow. I'd love to hear more why that is and how you think about that.
Yeah, I'd maybe just add that I was actually hoping to also ask Sergey to kind of give us your definition of what longevity is, right? Because some investors are doing longevity from a pure tech play, others are doing it from a pure biotech play. I think you guys are doing a hybrid, so it'd be great to have, okay, what do you guys understand as longevity? And then effectively what Andreas said is, well, where do you see it moving forward, and why you're so kind of bullish on it?
Right. So I would tackle it from different angles. So first and foremost, there is this thing which I always repeat, and that is we do not invest in life extension as a fund. What we invest in prolonging healthy human performance, right? And we invest in disease-modifying therapies or disease-modifying approaches that would allow us to remove certain age-related barriers that limit its healthy human performance or can abruptly stop us from performing altogether, right? And these are what age-related diseases are. So when you think about longevity, we as a VC, we have a pragmatic mandate, okay? So which means this is not this is not the turf of talking about the longevity pill or any sort of garage magic type of thing, right? It doesn't exist. It will never exist, most probably, in the nearest future for sure. So it's age-related disease focus. What I would invite you to do is I would kind of offer you to think about longevity in different frontiers of abstraction, if you wish. So the first frontier is what you can call kind of consumer adoption frontier, right? So consumer adoption level, longevity in mass as self-awareness, right? So that is something that is happening now. And it's happening on the level of us wearing wearables, us being more educated in terms of how to generate actionable insights or actionable interventions into our lifestyle in order to alter, certain areas of how we live and the quality of our life and how it impacts our well-being in the future, etc. It's about us getting more educated on the supplement side, for example, where if you look at the supplement landscape for longevity, NMNs are very popular right now, right? Although FDA recently told that these are actually drugs in the US, but nevertheless. So supplements, wearables, data-driven decisions, sort of consumer self-awareness of us living a healthier life, fasting, whatever. And then we're kind of growing the body of evidence around all these approaches and trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. All the apps belong in that category as well, right? So that's the first frontier. Now the second frontier is actually the age-related diseases, right? So, and this is where kind of we belong as a venture capital fund. We don't look that much into the first one, so we don't really fancy investing in apps and everything, right? We rather look at tackling diseases that are, again, abruptly stopping us from living longer or from enjoying or maintaining the healthy level of our physical and mental performance. So this is where you find different types of focuses for VCs. In our case, we kind of invest across two verticals. So the first one is therapeutics and the other one is non-therapeutics. So for the therapeutic vertical, we spend most of our time in immuno-oncology. And that is essentially looking at therapies, early stage therapeutics. And by early stage, I mean preclinical stage therapeutics that in one way or another recruit or trigger your immune system or your immune response, right? So both innate and adaptive immune response, obviously, to fight malignant cells, right? So oncology, cancer cells. We spend a lot of time in neurodegeneration, right? So where neurodegenerative conditions, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, MS as well, multiple sclerosis. These are sometimes very early killers of ours, and nothing is technically done, or there are no compelling approaches that could stop these from happening. So there are no disease-modifying therapies out there. So it's a huge unmet need. Only maintenance therapies, which sometimes have very questionable effects altogether with some patients. So that's that. And then the third therapeutic area for us, for example, where we spend most of our time in is epigenetic reprogramming. And this is where I don't know how familiar are you with epigenetics in general.
You should assume that most of our listeners understand everything that is VC talk and nothing that is life science talk.
Okay. So epigenetics, it's actually a pretty simple concept. So epigenetics has to do with the way of how your cells actually read your DNA, right? And one of the metaphors that I like about epigenetics is this comparison where you can imagine that your DNA is something digital, and epigenetic layer is something that is wrapped around your DNA. It's sort of the analog type of layer. So if you make an analogy with a CD disc, right, which has music on it. So when the CD disc is new, right, all the tracks are playing pretty well. It's not scratched. The tracks don't skip, right? And the epigenetics layer is sort of the needle that is reading the disc. So as you grow older, you accumulate DNA damage, right? You accumulate DNA damage, and the disc gets scratched, right? So your DNA actually accumulates this damage as you grow older, and the needle and the tracks start to skip, right? And the needle is starting to struggle with reading your DNA. And it's the exact way of how cells, as you age and as you accumulate DNA damage, some cells will lose their capacity to regenerate or to perform certain functions, which they did perform when you were younger and you were more capable of, well, rejuvenating yourself in a natural manner. So epigenetics has to do, epigenetic reprogramming rather, has to do with a whole body of methods of how to make cells, or how to kind of take cells back in time and restore this capacity of cells to read certain genes, or even make certain cells read certain genes in the areas of the body where they are not supposed to read them, right? Where, the cells in your liver are reading certain genetic code, and then the cells in your lungs are reading, well, you have the very same DNA, but they're reading different genes. So by altering these processes of how our cells interact with our genome, we kind of can trigger, reverse, or restore certain processes that are lost. And this is how we can trigger also tissue regeneration, for example. A very good example of this is the company which we have invested in. It's called Turn Biotechnologies. It's a Stanford spinout in epigenetics specifically. So one of their first indications was ophthalmology, retinal regeneration specifically, which was pretty successful for them already. It's a so-called local delivery. So with when you're doing something in an eye, so eye is basically a so-called immune privileged environment, and it's easier to achieve proof of concept. Now they're going into systemic delivery and starting to sort of gather cancer data. But realistically, so epigenetics is one of the very cool areas where VCs are looking at, and that's still, if you remember my definition, like first frontier. So we're still in the second frontier. Now, on the non-therapeutic side, it's kind of the same disease focus, but it's early detection of these age-related diseases. So it's not therapeutics, it's not early stage drugs, but it's rather very early detection of very same neurological disorders, oncology, et cetera, as well as personalized treatment. Now, some longevity enthusiasts or some longevity sort of evangelists would say that we might as well focus most of our time on very early prevention rather than coming up with new methods of how to treat age-related diseases in the late stages. Because technically speaking, if you have something in the late stage, you kind of failed to prevent it very early, right? So you kind of failed to recognize it very early. So prevention and early diagnostic methods are a huge area of interest, obviously. We have a couple of investments there as well. So one of our investments, for example, is AOA Diagnostics. So it's a company that does very early stage, super early detection of ovarian cancer in women, liquid biopsy, so blood test based, essentially. We recently did a deal with a Swiss company which is called Precomp, and Precomp does, they're capable of growing a tumor twin of a patient, so you can take a biopsy and then you can grow a tumor twin ex vivo outside of patient and rapidly test treatment combinations and see the tumor responses on these treatment combinations. And that sort of falls in the category of personalized treatment regimen selection of oncology, right? And then a separate block for us is AI for drug discovery. And this is where we have very strong historical connection with in silico medicine, which is now the leader in AI for drug discovery in the world. And we both basically have a lot of competences in the field. But then again, AI for drug discovery allows you to shorten the process of molecule candidate selection from 2 years down to 30 days. And technically speaking, with these approaches in mind, we can iterate faster, we can create drug candidates faster, and we can actually throw more drug candidates into preclinical and then clinical validation if we're talking about age-related diseases, right? So it kind of belongs into longevity as well. So that's the second tier. This is where we sit with our focus, right? And then the third tier is the bit of a sci-fi-ish visionary type of things, where we're talking about sort of systemic rejuvenation of the human being, where we're not talking about the patient, but rather taking David, for example, as a perfectly healthy, young individual, and rewinding David's biological age. Chronologically, you cannot really do it, right? It's only one way, but biological age to a certain extent, where David is forever, whatever, 25, 30, right? And chronological ticks forward, and then biological stays the same. The very same family of methods, for example, with cryonics or cryogenics or whatever you want to call them, right? So it's still sci-fi, still very fundamental science, very, very unproven. But then again, it's the third tier, like the third pillar of longevity tech. What I would, and this is where I'll shut up with my very lengthy answer to the question. Where I would put an emphasis here is some of the VCs like to do this visionary cryogenic type of investments, etc. We have a slightly different logic, and our logic is you cannot dream about space travel, and you cannot dream about these huge plans for the bright future before you actually tackle the problems in your backyard. And that is, it is kind of too early to talk about systemic rejuvenation of healthy individuals until we tackle age-related disorders in a comprehensive manner, right? So this is where we stand, and this is why we focus on age-related diseases more than just kind of big rejuvenation picture of healthy people. I hope it answers.
Sergey, I love hearing about this, and I imagine that or I can imagine how it works quite well. Once you actually get an LP on the first call or on the first meeting, because it is a space that is quite fascinating to hear about and think about, and I imagine that especially if you can talk about anything that's a first world problem, well, then it's about continuing our stay on this planet, because I think that's probably high on the agenda of most high net worth individuals. David, when you hear this, you've been a bit in this sector, not longevity, but health and bio and stuff. What do you think? What does it make you think as an LP?
It's really interesting. So I love the fact that Sergey, you kind of broke it down into 3 areas, and then the final one being this kind of extending lifetime kind of science fiction like kind of thing, because that's what I don't like about the longevity space, to be honest, for many reasons. But it's interesting because a lot of what I did when I started working in venture and life sciences was actually focused on chronic diseases, which is almost a similar way to say the same thing, right? It's diseases that affect quality of life in the long term. It's diseases that really have a humongous cost on healthcare systems as well across the globe, right? Europe specifically, but across the globe. So I do think there's an interesting overlap there. You did not talk about all chronic diseases though. So I think, and chronic diseases being like, maybe I'll let Sergey define that for our listeners, but being like diseases like cancer and so on, but others as well. How do you think about the type of diseases that you focus on as an investor?
I think it's a hard one. I don't have a definite answer here, right? In terms of so all chronic diseases obviously have an impact, right? So everywhere, starting from inflammatory bowel disease, so IBD, for example, which has an unmet need, all the way to diabetic patients, etc. Right? So there are a multitude of disease areas. What we have done is we kind of focused around those. You cannot be holistic. We're actually laser focused around several kind of families of technologies and several disease areas which we know best, right? Because this is how you can actually bring most value with your capital. So we kind of focused around biggest age-related associated killers with biggest unmet needs, right? And maybe even biggest variability that still doesn't allow us to come up with universally effective therapeutics for these disease areas, such as cancer. So like if you take 100 people with seemingly same type of cancer, you'll get 100 different sets of mutations for the tumors, right? Even though the cancer type is still the same. So we try to add value where we understand it best, and we try to add value in the most underserved segments where, for example, in neurodegenerative, we are actually lacking a single disease modifying therapy as we speak, right? So the key for us is indeed focusing on these very, very few segments. And even in cancer, I specifically mentioned immuno-oncology. Right? So we're looking at the ways, and we believe that's the future. We're looking at the ways of how you trigger the immune system in one way or another to aid, right, the clearance process, the malignant cell clearance process in cancer. And if you look at immuno-oncology, for example, we have very few drugs in the market. anti-PD-1 drugs, so-called anti-PD-1 drugs, are the most popular, the most well-known ones, right? So one is Keytruda, which is a blockbuster seller for Merck. The other one is Opdivo, which is BMS, Bristol Myers. But that's it. And they were FDA approved, 2014, 2015. So it's like, it's not even a decade. So it's a huge unmet need. And we still don't know so many things when it comes to immune responses in cancers. We don't know pretty much anything specific about tumor microenvironment, about how cancer is capable of hiding from our immune systems. And this is why our immune systems don't react, right? So why our T cells are so exhausted and they don't react to cancer cells, etc. So we try adding value in a very laser focused way. To be completely honest with you, every single big chronic disease domain, even IBD, you can which I'd mentioned, right? So inflammatory bowel disease, it's tremendously nasty thing to have for patients. The quality of life is really low for these patients, right? You can build a separate fund around it. Like, you can build a separate fund that would invest specifically in IBD therapeutics. So yeah, it's really the competencies that we have, and this is how we focus.
I have a bit of a completely different question, and maybe also on the light end in terms of kicking it up against the other discussions that we've had here. But
sure,
as a longevity investor, are you yourself or anyone close to you that are doing the same thing also like these longevity buffs them yourself, where you're like, okay, I'm not seeing one of those rings on your finger, but are you tracking all types of different blood levels and I don't know what, and super thinking about that? Or do you meet many co-investors that are like that, thinking about performance of the body all the time and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, right. Practice what you preach, right? So I'm a bad example. Okay, the reason I'm actually, so it's not that I don't have rings or anything on my arms. I also have a mechanical watch, which is not a smart watch at all. Now, so I'm a bad example, not because of it though. I'm a bad example because being a rare disease patient, I kind of have my own regimen of maintaining myself, which is not necessarily translatable to a human being that wants to, a healthy human being, right? So I did. I can actually share a bit of an insight. So, but I did a fair bit of biohacking myself. Being a neurodegenerative patient, what you have is you are very often encountering the maintenance regimen, which involves steroids. And it's basically where you are constantly suppressing your immune system so that it doesn't trigger any other autoimmune reactions that you might have. And in neurodegenerative field, autoimmune reactions are tremendously nasty, right? Like, you don't want any relapses. It throws your life down the drain. So what I figured is, instead of doing steroids, where you can achieve the very similar sort of immune suppressive effects, is by subjecting yourself to constant high level of aerobic
I was about
exercise.
to say, you're going to say something along the lines of keeping myself super exhausted.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. So if you look at the research for marathon runners or professional athletes, you'll see that they seem very fit and healthy and whatever, but their white cell blood levels, right, are sometimes 5 times lower than normal human beings. So their immune systems are suppressed. So if you do this constantly, you kind of achieve the same effect. So this is what I'm doing, right? So I'm running 75, 80 kilometers per week. I do marathons, I do triathlon, whatever. So I kind of, but it's for a very specific purpose. It's not because of the cliche, like, I want to be fit type of thing, but it actually works for me.
Coming from a guy who have done steroids, I would say, well, you maybe should try it. It's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, right. I'm talking corticosteroids though, right? The ones,
mine were anabolic,
not the ones that are getting you buffed, right? But the ones that suppress inflammation. So that's one thing. And then but for the person that just wants to kind of maintain the healthy level of understanding what's happening, I would honestly offer just two things. A, you really should do regular checkups. And I think our prevention methods as we speak in general healthcare practice are good enough for you to spot, serious age-related conditions pretty early if you are actually vigilant about it. So that's one. And then the other one, do your genome sequencing, right? So get your genome sequenced, understand, we're pretty good already in understanding which mutations trigger which risk levels of you getting something in the future, right? So just understand like what is your risk map and what are the areas you need to spend most of your time sort of monitoring closely, right? So that if something happens and you have an increased risk of cancer, for example, you catch it early and you can apply an adequate treatment regimen and you'll most probably be fine. So it's actually basic things. And one of the worst things that you can do to yourself actually is smoking.
Yeah.
And seriously, like it's one of the worst things you can do, and it's a completely voluntary choice that people take. Right? No one forces you to do it. People just do it. So the other one is okay, debatable in small doses, but abuse of alcohol, of course, etc. Again, very basic, known for decades, but it is actually very bad. It increases the stress on your cells. It decreases their ability to regenerate, etc., etc. So don't do basic things. Do basic checkups. And just try to know yourself a bit more, even genetically. Like, the cost of genome sequencing has dropped tremendously now. Like, genome sequencing is, by the way, the one that is not following the Moore's law, right? It's like, the cost has been dropping tremendously over the years. It's now what, $200, $300 for a fully sequenced genome. You should go.
It's incredibly interesting, and I think that most VCs probably fall in the category of course, I want to know, and of course, I want to be proactive. But the general, at least in Denmark, the conversation that we have had in Denmark, on a societal level around genome sequencing is that people don't want to know. And, I'm like, well, why wouldn't you want to know that you have a high risk towards developing this disease? And then, you can track it. And as you say, you can catch it early. It's incredibly interesting.
I also think though this type of behavior also has a right to exist. It's not rational, but for some people it's the method of coping. And that is also perfectly fine. And this is something that is very much observed in patients with terminal illnesses. And that is where, cancer patients, for example, kind of do not acknowledge the fact, or they don't want to acknowledge the fact that they now actually need to subject their life to very specific and very radical changes in order to incorporate the treatment regimen, and they will not be able to do what they have been doing before, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of this has to do with like psychological comfort that we are not ready to sacrifice. Although, look, our brains are wired evolutionary. They're wired in a way that if I tell you that in 10 years, something will happen to you. Like in 10 years, you will get this or that. If you don't stop what you're doing now, I will trigger the very same area of your brain, which is getting triggered when you're talking about the person that you don't know, someone on the street, right? So you're not associating, Andreas today with Andreas in 10 years. Like these are two totally different human beings, and you don't have anything to do with that guy from the future, right? And this seems to be one of the big problems, to be honest. It's how we think about it.
Well, we've got it on a global level with the planet we're on, right?
Yeah, right. Indeed,
That's
indeed.
Absolutely true, guys. I really enjoyed the conversation so far. Few people know this, Sergey, but part of the reasons why I actually decided to do some stuff in life sciences is because my dad passed away with a cancer. So I love the role that innovation and capital can play in actually solving real life problems like that, instead of just creating a new widget or a feature that I don't honestly give a fuck about. Anyway, moving on. We always end the episodes with a quick fire round, Sergey. It's quick answer questions, 30 to 60 seconds each. Are you ready?
I'll try. I'll do my best.
I love that you said go even before I asked if you're ready. So I'm excited about this one. First question, and you kind of answered this one already, but let's restate it. What areas, technologies, or sectors excite you the most that other people don't really feel that excited about?
Epigenetics, number one. Immuno-oncology, number two. Neurodegeneration, number three. These are, I think, sectors of my utmost excitement if we're talking technological areas and age-related diseases.
Yeah. Second question as a quick fire round is, what are your top tips for emerging VCs across Europe who are raising their funds?
Well, that depends on the industry, right? But the top tip is be an added value VC for your LPs as well. I mean, smart capital is a very overabused term, and obviously you need to be useful for the companies that you're investing in, especially if you're an early stage VC. Otherwise, you don't make any sense as a capital provider. But be helpful, be useful to your LPs as well. Educate them, provide them with investment opportunities, and sort of give them access to your infrastructure. It helps. It really helps. And then be realistic about how. What are your targets? Don't sort of spray and pray, but try to capitalize on the very exact field of competence that you have, where your MVP knowledge essentially is.
I love that. Great tips there. Third and final question, Sergey, what is the most counterintuitive thing you've learned since you've been in venture?
The most counterintuitive thing. It's not counterintuitive. Okay, it's not very well known, actually. Best deals in biotech, specifically, best investments in biotech, most promising investments in biotech, happen before anyone actually knows that the company was raising in the first place. So the biggest kind of goes back to your tips point, by the way.
Yeah.
One of the biggest value props for a VC is getting into allocations, getting invited into most promising stuff. So whenever you see a VC fishing deals from the market, chances are a fund is lacking a proprietary deal pipeline, right? Yeah. And in biotech, it's the king of the game.
Yeah. Very cool tip, and comes back to I really believe in this. VC is all about access, right? That's basically it.
It's also a people's business, by the way.
Yeah.
It's also a people's business. You always, even biotech in early stages, you invest in teams first and foremost. IP, yes, but teams are the top of the list, because these are essentially people that either make it or break it.
Yeah, absolutely. Sergey, thanks so much for joining us. This was a very educational session on something that we rarely talk about, rarely think about, but we all should be spending a bit of money and time on. Thanks a million, Sergey.
Thanks, guys. And I think longevity should actually be number one on our agendas, because aging is the number one problem everyone has. Disregarding their socioeconomic status, their financial capacity, we will all die of aging or age-related diseases. So let's team up and do something about it. Yeah? Sounds like a plan. But thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the European VC, the go-to podcast for everything European VC. If you love the show, share it with your friends and join our newsletter at EU.VC.